New Frontier in a Great Society, Section 2, with Ms. Lashy. Kennedy's foreign policy. President Kennedy was against communism. He said that he would do anything possible to contain the spread of communism. Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro led a liberation movement in Cuba in 1959. Cuba had been controlled by a brutal dictator named General Batista. Castro made an alliance with the Soviet Union. He also nationalized businesses that were owned by Americans, such as sugar. He limited land ownership. Anyone who spoke out against him was imprisoned. Bay of Pigs. While Eisenhower was president, he began a program of training Cuban exiles for a planned invasion of Cuba. When Kennedy became president, he continued with the operation. He refused to provide air support, which would make American involvement undeniable. The exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs just 3 months after Kennedy became president. They were unsuccessful. Some of the exiles admitted that the U.S. had aided them despite orders not to do so. The Bay of Pigs became a huge embarrassment for Kennedy and his foreign policy. Nikita Khrushchev. He was the premier of the Soviet Union during the late 1950s and early 1960s. He was anti-Stalin but supported communism. He was the leader of the Soviet Union during the U-2 spy plane incident and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Premier just means he was the leader, so Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall. In 1961, the Soviet Union built a wall in Berlin. The wall cut off Eastern Germany from the West. East Germany wanted to stop the flow of human resources to West Germany. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, U.S. spy planes flew over Cuba and discovered that missile silos were being built. Previously, Soviet missiles were unable to reach the U.S. from Asia or Europe. If missiles were brought to Cuba, they would be only 90 miles off U.S. shores. The U.S. initiated a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent any further Soviet weapons from reaching Cuba. President Kennedy also said that if the missiles that were already there were not withdrawn, that the U.S. would invade Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis continued. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had come to nuclear war up to that point. Khrushchev said that he would remove the Soviet missiles if the U.S. promised to not invade Cuba. In return, Kennedy also said that he would remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, a hotline was established between the United States and Soviet leaders. They also agreed to ban any further testing of nuclear weapons with the exception of underground. So the hotline was just creating a means of communications directly between the White House and the Kremlin, which is the White House version in the Soviet Union. That way the leaders of the United States and Soviet Union could talk directly with each other, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was days that they had to wait for communication to go through the proper channels, through ambassadors and whatnot, before it got to the leaders. And so the world literally was sitting on the edge of their seats waiting to see if somebody was going to use a nuclear weapon. And as you can tell by this political cartoon here, we have JFK and Khrushchev, and they both have their fingers on the buttons on atomic weapons or nuclear weapons. These are particularly the hydrogen bomb. You can see with the H on it, it's called the H-bomb, hydrogen bomb. The Kennedy assassination. November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was campaigning for re-election in Dallas, Texas. While riding in a motorcade, he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The Kennedy assassination became a major conspiracy, as there have been many theories about who may have been behind the assassination. Kennedy's vice president assumed office.